Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeology Book Club. My name is Ginny, and I'm a community archaeologist here at Dig Ventures. We're a team of archaeologists on a mission to connect people who love archaeology with opportunities to get involved, whether that's in the field on a dig or online in events like today. And we're very, very excited to be kicking off the year with a brand new Archaeology Book Club. Today, I'm joined by two fantastic speakers. We have Dig Ventures' own co-founder and co-CEO, Brendon Wilkins, and of course, our special guest, author and archaeologist, Jim Leary. Today, we're going to learn more about Jim's new book, Footmarks, A Journey into Our Restless Past. Brendon and Jim discuss the key themes and inspirations behind the book and share some of the behind-the-scenes process of writing. Plus, as always, we'll have a Q&A at the end where you'll be able to get involved. Whether you've already read the book or have it in your reading list ready to go, we can't wait to hear from all of you. Just before we get started, I'll do a quick bit of housekeeping. As always, please do remember to keep it friendly in the chat, but of course share any comments, responses, or questions in there, and we'll take a look at them later. And please, of course, as always, be patient with us. It is technology, and if anything goes wrong, we'll make sure that we fix it ASAP, but please do give us a moment to do so. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers to get started. Hello, Jim and Brendon.
Hi there. Hi, Jim. Good to see you.
Hi, Brendon. Fantastic to see you.
I've got to full disclosure, I'm a great fan of your book, and I hope that came through in my recent review in Antiquity. Well, at least I hope it did, otherwise this might make this a little bit awkward. but first things first, I'm really interested in what inspired you to write this book. It's quite unlike other archaeology books, which tend to take more of a general view on perhaps a thematic area, or go deep into a very specific area. But instead, you take us on this journey. We go through elements of travel log and historical narrative and personal reflection. You know, what made you decide to write a book like this?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me on to your book club, and thank you very much for that fantastic review in Antiquity. Much appreciated. So my inspiration, well, I mean, I suppose I've always been a traveller. I've always travelled. I've always been in love with the idea of travelling. I've always had this deep sense of wanderlust. I spent my childhood travelling around. I write about it in the book. You know, I was from 0 to 3 years old. I lived in Malaysia. Then for the next few years, we lived in Fiji, and then a bit of time back here, and then Cyprus, and so it went on. My whole life has been peripatetic in a sense. I have no great sense of place at home, but I have a strong sense of movement and mobility. So it's kind of, in a sense, it was already there. That was the context was there. But and as a child, I absolutely loved reading travel books. I didn't really read children's books. I read Jupiter's Travels and things like, you know, people traveling across V.S. Naipaul books. You know, I loved reading about movement and mobility and traveling around. So it's kind of always there. And then in adult life, I've been inspired by other writers. Robert Macfarlane stands out as a fantastic writer about movement. And there's a whole plethora of them. I mean, there's tons. It's an entire genre of non-fiction literature on walking and paths and moving around and stuff, and I love them all. But I suppose what really frustrated me in a sense was that archaeologists weren't part of that discussion. Even though these writers do write a lot about archaeology, they do it in a very simplistic manner, not a massively well informed manner from an archaeological point of view. And I was frustrated by the fact that archaeologists don't sort of engage with movement and mobility very much, which is kind of understandable because movement is this intangible thing. You can't dig up movement.
Yes.
I saw somebody compared it once to wind. You know, you don't see wind; you just see the impact of wind on other things.
Yes.
So you don't see the impact of movement. You don't see itself. It's very fleeting.
I love that idea. I love that you brought those kind of two worlds, the personal and the professional, together in this book. And we know also about the similar kinds of books. In fact, Matthew Green's Shadowlands, which is another journey style book, we've also covered on the Dig Ventures book club as well. So what is it that an archaeologist brings to this whole genre of journeying? What's the uniquely archaeological perspective?
Well, I think, I mean, I talk about the archaeologist's superpower, the superpower of archaeology, which is that length of time, the longue durée, they call it. It's this understanding of the past as being this real tangible thing. It's not there as a plaything for modern writers. It's a real thing, and the past was written by people's feet, the average person's feet. It really frustrated me because there's loads and loads of books about called The History of Walking, and some fantastic writers, people like Rebecca Solnit and people, they've written these books called the History of, Wanderlust, The History of Walking, and so on. Well, when you read these books, as wonderful as they are, the history of walking seems to be the history of people who write walking, or sometimes the history of philosophers that walked. It's a very select group of people, whereas what archaeology offers, of course, is this mass of people, people behind us that left their trails in the ground. And that's what I wanted to get to. I'm not too fussed about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, thoughtful wonders and great things, or even Darwin's walk around his garden. What I wanted was the trail of workers that left deep holloways as they trudged backwards and forwards from the medieval castle to their settlement, or people moving their cows from the lowland to the upland seasonally every year. That was what I wanted, the real person, the person that I could relate to. So that's where it came from.
That's really interesting. And hallways we may touch on later. They're very emblematic within the book. But you kind of like bringing the archaeological view and perspective into this field, but almost you're showing a way for other archaeologists to contribute as well. Would you like to see more of us in this place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that we do have, everybody has at their fingertips, is their own personal experience. And I get slightly frustrated when I read about archaeologists writing about the past, anything to do with the past, let alone just moving in the past, and they themselves are removed from it. So what I was very keen to do with Footmarks is to make sure that I was in there, not for egotistical reasons, but just to say, listen, I'm part of this, you're part of this, and my experience is important. So there is a lot of there's a lot of me in it. There's a lot of stories from my background. There's moments of grief, and there's moments of mental health issues that I talk about, because walking is amazing for healing a tired mind. It's got everything in. It's got everything in there, and I'd love to see much more of that. And the one thing I'd say is that when archaeologists strip out that side of things and they start writing about, I don't know, say moving in the past, they end up with something that's incredibly abstract, so sort of high-minded and theoretical that it's almost of no relevance to my life. So you end up with people talking about optimal foraging strategies for hunter-gatherers moving. I go, what the hell is an optimal foraging strategy? For goodness sake, I've lived for 50 years and I've never once thought to myself, I'm going to optimize my foraging strategy right now. I go for a walk. I walk down to the shop or whatever.
Yeah, that's where you go to Lidl for the basics and then nip into Waitrose for the special olives or something. So it's very broad in scope, your book. And I'm interested in that, and also this writing process as you're inviting us all, the other archaeologists, to join you. You cover 3.5 million year old footprints and John Travolta on the same page. It's hugely enjoyable. I think in Antiquity, I called it like an invigorating walk with a friend, followed perhaps by light refreshment. So tell me, did the words flow as easy onto the page as they are for us to read?
No. Oh, I wish they could. I mean, I think the writing process is a really interesting discussion, and we could easily fill 2-3 hours talking about it. So I won't go into too much depth, but I do think it's important. I think what's really important is to point out that that anybody can be a writer. Anyone can do writing, and this seems really stupidly obvious, but actually in this country, in particularly in the Western world, we sort of have this idea that writers somehow are kind of, they're touched by an angel when they're born or something. They're gifted. So many people I know have said to me, "Oh, I'd love to write, but I just can't." Everybody can write. Everybody can write. That's the good news. The bad news is it's incredibly hard work. Everyone can write, but you've got to put in the hours. It's grueling. I mean, it's to write a full book, and I'm not necessarily talking about academic writing. I'm talking about trade. Writing for the trade market. Popular book is hard. It's really, really hard work, but it's so rewarding. It's so much fun, and it's a case of getting a really good routine and sticking to that routine. So my process, and I'll just very briefly tell us before I move on to the structure of Footmarks, but very, very briefly, my routine is I get up early. So I get up at 5 or 6 in the morning because I write best first thing. I'll head out to where I am now, which is a pod in my garden, which has got underfloor heating and is nicely warmed. I have the heating set to come on at 4:30, so by the time I come out with my pot of tea, it's nice and toasty.
We can see it behind you, nicely referenced. It is amazing.
So I'll work early in the morning, and I'll start by reading what I wrote the day before. And usually I'll start with watching something like BBC Maestro is quite good. There's lots of sort of courses and little videos you can watch. So I'll usually watch one of those, and then I'll do some exercises. Exercises are very, very important, especially when you get to my age. I start and end every day with a bit of an exercise from a app on my phone, and then I just get into it, and I'll read what I wrote the day before, and I'll start writing, and that's my daily rhythm. My monthly rhythm is very different. Monthly rhythm, I generally will write a chapter a month, and I'll go up and down throughout that month. So I start off with reading and writing notes. The first week is basically just note writing, and I can write 10,000 words quite easily of notes. And generally at that stage, I don't know what I'm doing with that chapter, and I'm panicking, and I'm generally a bit grumpy. The second week is turning those notes into essentially pages of stream of consciousness thoughts and reorganizing it. And then the third and the fourth week is actually then turning it into something that someone else could read. By the end of the month, I generally am quite happy and I'm relaxed by that stage. But then, of course, the new month starts, and I've got to do the whole damn thing again. Yes. But once I've finished with that, so one month for 5,000 words, that's just a draft. Then I work through it, and I work through it. As I'm writing the next chapter, I'm going back over that one, and then my wife will read it, and I'll get comments back from her, and then it will go off to my editor at the publishers, and then it gets ripped apart and dissected, and I have to go back in, and it's hard work. You think you finish something, and you find yourself months later going back and having to redo stuff, and it can be really grueling, and it can be really hard work, as anything that's rewarding is hard work. So I suppose what I want to say to people is everyone can write.
Yes.
You need to put in the hours, and if it's really hard work, that's all part of the damn process. You just have to put on your big boy pants or your big girl pants and get through that, and then you're the other side, and then it's wonderful and rewarding. But
that's really good. I mean, it reminds me of the could well have been the Hemingway quote: "Writing's easy. I just turn up at the page and bleed." But although almost to put people off, I think there's only a handful of Hemingways around publishing books. But I really like that idea of democratizing writing, that everybody can have a go. Everyone can do it.
Everyone can do it. It's just, like I say, it's hard work, and this idea. My students at the university often have this belief that I literally, opened the book at page 1 and I wrote that first line, and then I just went and I just kept writing, and over a few months I ended up with a whole book. doesn't work like that. What you write at the beginning is nothing like what it is at the end. You prettify it and you beautify it, and it goes to people. My agent looks at it, the editors look at it, and so on and so on. So by the end, it's great. But that doesn't, and I think that it can be really off-putting to anybody who wants to write, but reads something that someone's written and go, "Oh, that's gleaming. I wish I could write like that." Well, you can, but you've got to put in the hours. But
Excellent. Well, thanks for that peek behind the wizard's curtain there. and so to focus in on actually the content of the book, and particularly your ideas around mobility in the past. So one of the central themes of Footmarks is that we need to shift our perspective from these static sites to dynamic movement of people throughout history. And you argue, and I quote, shifting our focus to the way people moved, we infuse the past with a dynamism and vital force it once contained, letting it live in the present. So for our readers who perhaps aren't as familiar with the habitual ways of archaeological thinking, can you expand on that and explain what you mean?
Yeah, so I mean, I talked about the book really coming out of a frustration that I don't think the archaeological voice is within that broader literature of walking, and that I don't think moving around is really in the minds of most archaeologists, and that's why I want to sort of talk about it. To me, movement is the richest part of humanity, and by stripping it out, what I think in the book I describe it as a form of disenchantment by taking away movement and mobility. And to provide a bit of an example, I mean, when I was excavating down in Wiltshire, I was excavating this beautiful Neolithic floor, which I write about in the book. Now, on the floor, so it's a Neolithic building, late Neolithic building, and on the floor are pieces of flint flakes and pieces of pottery left almost entirely as they were when people abandoned that building and took away, the walls collapsed and then they built a bank over it and it preserved. Now, as an archaeologist, we record that and we go, yeah, that's this is a floor, and let's look at the patterning, and we look at the flints, and we look at the pottery, and they all go off to the specialist, and we miss the movement of it. Just outside this building was a pile of pig bones, which had clearly been evidence for feasting activity, because they were still articulated and so on, and they were covered in, they were charred and covered in flint tool marks, so they'd been eaten. What I want to do is to inject all that movement back in, so the people moving around the floor, the smell of the pigs being roasted, what was going on. There was another on the other side was an outdoor bonfire, so you could imagine, flames and perhaps even garish costumes, and was there chanting and dancing associated with this feasting and so on. And I want to put all of that back in there, but habitually we archaeologists sort of strip that side of it out. I found the same sort of thing when I was excavating into Silbury Hill, a massive late Neolithic monumental mound in Wiltshire near Avebury. When we were in the tunnel, what we could see was that the mound was just constantly moving, constantly evolving. People were doing stuff, digging in ditches, piling up, and it just went on and on and on until you create this final great big monument. Now, of course, it's almost kept in like in a bell jar. It's protected, which is completely right, of course. But what it does is strip out all of the movements that created it. So I wanted to inject all of that back in. And there's lots of reasons why we need to do that, not least because if we ignore movement and mobility, we start ignoring paths and trails and holloways that we mentioned briefly.
Sure.
And once we do that, then, these things get destroyed, they get removed.
Sure. So this is an example of how archaeological methods, which trying to impose control and organize all this plethora of evidence of the past into neat categories of time or place, can actually somehow work against us getting closer to understanding and feeling and empathizing with the past. And particularly, it sees its high point in how we now protect and conserve in a way which we just freeze things in time. Of course, we're not really freezing them in time. We're freezing the last 50 years because things have changed completely all the way through. Tell me about that last bit of your quote, letting it live in the present. So, what would, if all of archaeology was to shift its perspective and viewpoint to this point of view that you argue, what would that mean for archaeology and society?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think Silbury Hill is quite a good example of that. So we've got, on the one hand, we have Silbury Hill, which is a monument that's kept in aspect, effectively preserved, and people stand there. Some people climb it, which they're not meant to do, but people stand there and look at it and wonder and so on. Just down the road from Silbury Hill, we have the Marlborough Mound, where we now know from work I did some years ago that the Marlborough Mound is the same date as Silbury Hill. But of course, people didn't know that up until I did some coring work and dating work on it. And so it was constantly. It's within Marlborough College, and it's been part of Marlborough College for a long time. And before that, it was part of a big sort of estate house. Uh, Big sort of manorial estates, and was a garden mount and so on. What the Marlborough Mound has is this sense of movement. There are things. There's a grotto in it. There's a spiral path around it. It was used for teaching. It was put, it used to have a water tower on the top of it. There's a real sense of continued movement with it that Silbury doesn't have. For me, Marlborough Mound is alive. Silbury is in stasis. No, I think it's a difficult ask to say. Well, we should be doing imaginative things with these monuments. Well, I think we should be. I think we should be allowing, a certain amount of relatively low impact things to keep them alive. And I feel the same about paths. If we don't walk a path, it dies. Holloways are meant to be walked. They're created literally. They're worn down. They're hollowed out by feet and in the past, carriage wheels clattering and horses' hooves and animals up and down them and rainwater and so on. If we stop walking them, then they just go. And because holloways are not considered as monuments, they are, because we don't talk about movement enough, they're off the archaeological, they're below the radar, so to speak. They get infilled, they get grubbed out, they get removed. It's happening all around me at the moment. I see a holloway, I take a photo of it, put it on social media, and goes, "Oh, that's a great holloway." I'll go back there a week later, and it's gone.
Shocking.
Or someone's messed around with it, So I think that we can't just keep these things in aspect. We should be maintaining them as things for movement, as they always were in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating that we have these fixed points of the landscape, our monuments, which we want to stay still and not move. But those parts of the landscape that show movement, we almost neglect them and don't protect them enough. It's interesting that you've got those two polar opposites.
It's literally come out of the idea. It's literally come from the fact that people do not routinely think about movement, which is exactly the frustration I had before I wrote the book, and why I wrote the book, to say, hey, let's talk about this stuff. Let's get that discussion going.
Yeah. So there's lots of almost quiet revolutions happening in archaeology, particularly around archaeology science and looking in absolute minute detail down to things like ADNA or isotopic analysis. Is this helping with that sense of movement?
Oh, completely. It's absolutely revolutionized movement. So all of a sudden we're talking about it. What we don't yet have is a very good theoretical framework to hang it on. So quite a lot of the discussions, particularly ancient DNA, are quite simplistic and basic. But we're getting there. But yeah, no, they're fundamentally changing how we're understanding movement. And we see it in so there's isotopes, there's ancient DNA, but there's also the skeletal evidence. We were now looking for movement within the bones. Movement changes and shapes the bones. I talk about this quite a bit in the book. The idea that in the Neolithic, using a quern will strengthen one arm over another, and that's visible in the skeleton. I excavated this amazing teenage Bronze Age burial down in the Vale of Pewsey, and he was 14 and a half, between 14 and a half and 15 and a half when he died. But we can see the movements he's done over his life, quite hard movements. He had what the osteologist called sort of athlete's legs. So he had big glutes and big solid, and he had joint problems in his knees, so he'd been doing a lot of uphill walking, a lot of upper body lifting. Considering he was pretty young. So we can see movement so much more now.
No, that's tremendous. I kind of see it as a zooming in to the minute detail, even the atoms that can tell us this story. But there's also a zooming out, which I feel is another revolution happening in archaeology, and particularly using Earth observation data, satellite imagery, or LiDAR, or even basic drones. That now, instead of thinking of a landscape as a series of dots on a map, we can start to see the linkages between these sites. And it puts us in mind of the people moving between. Have you used any of this in your work? We've got, of course, our favourite, my favourite project, Deep Time, which has done this. But have you had that in your work out as well?
Well, the structure of the book, as you know, is a journey. So it goes from that very small scale. So I talk about footprints at the beginning, and then slowly as the chapters go on, I get bigger and bigger until by the end I'm talking about migration and sea crossings and stuff like that, and that's kind of the biggest scale that I go to. So I stop at migration and sea travel. But yeah, I think that the technology is really completely revolutionising how we're seeing movement in the past. It's actually put it right back on the agenda again, which is fantastic to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got lots of questions in the chat, which I want to come to soon. But I'm really interested in what's next for you. Is there a sequel, or is it Footmarks Part 2? This time it's even more personal.
Yeah, so there is. I am working on something at the moment. I'm so the structure of Footmarks was really hard. It was really tough because mobility is such a massive topic, right? So I kind of had this. I had weeks where I just was in a foul mood because I just thought, I can't do this. How can you talk about movement in the past? And then I sort of hit upon this idea that I mentioned of doing it as a journey, but going from the small scale and gradually getting bigger. And that kind of made sense. But I can see a lot of the reviews have been about it jumps from the deep past to the modern day, and it jumps around quite a lot, and I thought to myself, do I want to tackle something like that again? So I've gone for something a bit easier in terms of structure. So the next book, the book I'm writing at the moment, which is still at the early stages, is a book about the Neolithic, and there I've kind of got the structures there for me because I can take it in a chronological point of view. Yeah, that's what I'm working on at the moment. Footmarks carries on. It's just been translated into Chinese, and there are discussions for other language versions of it. But yeah, that's my mind at the moment is very much in the Neolithic, and of course that's a great period for movement and mobility. We know from ancient DNA that the early Neolithic people have come across from the continent to the British Isles, and we know that the ending of the Neolithic happens when other people move across, and the Bronze Age begins. So yeah, so movement is still very much a part of it.
Excellent. And you'll hear more about our own site from the early Neolithic in Brendon, which we have another presentation shortly, which Ginny will tell everyone about in a second. But thinking about digging as well, what are you digging at the moment? Do you have a project that everyone can follow along?
Yeah, I'm digging at the moment. I'm digging out in Skipsea in Holderness, an amazing landscape. It's sort of between the Yorkshire Wolds on one side and then the North Sea on the other side, and it's kind of this landscape that sits apart from the rest of the United Kingdom. Things kind of have always happened slightly differently there. It's a people that have always looked across the sea for uh, much more so than looking inland to the rest of Britain. So it's this kind of little world, but it's just wonderful, and it's made up of strings of Mesolithic lakes. Just to the north is Lake Flixton and Starcar and these amazing Mesolithic artifacts. Well, we have a whole series of lakes that will have their versions of Starcar around it. And then we know that in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age, people had settlements around it. There's actually Bronze Age woodwork, so I'm hoping for kind of like a must farm there. The preservation is absolutely amazing within these lakes. And then there's an amazing medieval landscape. So it's this sort of multi-period site that I'm excavating with our students from the University of York. And of course, that's a landscape that's all about movement because it's so watery and wet that the main form of moving around was dugout canoe right through prehistory and up through into the medieval period. It's only really when Dutch engineers were brought across in the 18th and 19th century that it was drained and turned into fields.
Excellent. So you're putting into practice all these theories around mobility right down at the trowel level and digging things in the ground. That's really great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think when something like mobility is something that just is a thread that will run through the rest of my career. It's not something that I feel like I've done and I've put that away now. It's it wasn't. It's something that exists within me, and it will keep coming up and keep coming out, and I'll keep searching for sites that show it. Always looking for these, trackways. There's the trackways across these lakes and so on. So yeah, I'm really excited about getting stuck into that rich area.
Superb, superb. So I think it's time that we go to our community and see if we have any questions. Ginny, is anything in the chat that you want to bring to us?
There is indeed. So we do have a couple of questions so far. This first question will feel a bit strange. It is from Brendon Wilkins, but it is not. This is from Lisa via Brendon's account.
I wondered where my phone was.
Lisa was wondering, this will be for you, Jim, if thinking about movement has changed how you excavate your own sites or how you consider them in relation to other sites.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've sort of touched on this a little bit just then, but yeah, I mean, I'm really conscious that the movement that goes on above the site, and there are loads of movements when you're digging a site. People coming and going, and wheelbarrows being wheeled in and out, and shovels moving. It's just all this movement and people and stuff. But when we find stuff, we see it as this sort of static thing, this fixed thing in the past, and we record it on paper, and there it is, or we digitally record it. What I want to do is get away from that completely. So making sure that we are including movement and mobility in all of our interpretations, but also not focusing only on monuments, but looking at all the spaces in between the monuments, which are where the movements happen. I talk about in the book about how archaeologists, they see a site as a distinct thing, and when we schedule it, we put a line around it, and that's an important thing, and you can go to it and come out of it. But actually, in the past, that of course was never the case. It was a series of entangled movements. Sites are kind of a knotty tangle of movements. That's all that's what a site is. So by understanding that, we can actually start searching the wider area. And the other thing that we can do is use environmental archaeology to try and find paths. I talk in the book, and I've spoken quite widely about the fact that the paths we walk down now, are very distinct ecosystems. If you walk down a path that's got blackberries and crab apples and hazelnuts all the way along it, well, the reason it has those along a path is because people have planted them, and also, they've eaten the crab apples and spat the pips out, or eaten blackberries and defecated it out by the side of the path, and so it goes on. And they create these linear corridors of a very distinct ecosystem, a very distinct environment. You step off the path, and it looks very different either side. Well, we can use that now archaeologically by trying to identify linear sites using environmental archaeology. So that's the other way that I think we can start bringing that into our own way of doing stuff.
Sure, and we've seen that as well in our own landscape level work, particularly with citizen science mapping habitats. That actually, if you layer that habitat data over the historic environment, you can see it tightly clustering around historic sites, like routeways, hollowways, or what might be called ghost ponds, previous wet areas, or shadow woods, woodlands that have gone now. And this in some way can really be a blueprint for future landscape regeneration and nature recovery.
Yeah.
Have you seen any of this kind of thing in your own work, or are archaeologists still very siloed into their own archaeology space and ecologists into theirs?
Oh, they're completely siloed. I mean, we are completely siloed all the time, and it's about sort of breaking out from that. I thought it's really interesting, just thinking about holloways. And again, I've written a lot about holloways. I love holloways. I think they're wonderful sites. They're very evocative. I walked down one just before coming on here, and I'll probably walk down another one later on today. But they're very distinct ecosystems themselves, because they're quite, especially the very deeply incised holloways, because they don't get light throughout the day and throughout the year, so they have a different sort of ecosystem down there, and because of that, they are important for nature conservation people, because of their difference. And recently there was a project to look at holloways, and to try and get a sense of how many holloways there are. This was done in Dorset. No one has attempted an audit of holloways across the country, but that's got to be something we have to do at some point. But I thought it was really interesting that it was Natural England that did that project, i.e., these are important ecosystems. It wasn't Historic England, i.e., this is an important heritage asset, as they call it. There's a real distinct difference there, that we see these things not as archaeology, not as the past, but as a unique environment. And we've got to link that up. We've got to be better at linking that up. We've got to start we've got to start scheduling some of these holloways, for goodness sake. There's not one that's been scheduled because it's an important holloway.
Yes, that's shocking to hear. Andy Jeffries and team at Natural England, good friends of ours, and it's phenomenal to see it come from that bridge being made from that side. And if archaeologists can build the bridge from the other side, then perhaps things would look better. But how would we go about this? It feels almost like a mindset shift that's needed.
Yeah, I think it is a mindset shift, but we do need to be doing it. I'm working with the North York Moors National Park, and have a PhD student which we jointly supervise. And Davey Stapley, and he's doing a fantastic job at looking at the holloways on the North York Moors, because there are lots of them. And what he's discovering is that there are lots and lots of them, ones that are not on any map. They're not in any HER. And he's using LiDAR. So, you were talking about that sort of big scale mapping. He's using that big data to map these holloways. And I think that, and he's doing that just on a part of the North York Moors. There's a bigger project that we're hoping to put together to look at the whole of the North York Moors, but we need to be doing that all the way across the country,
Yeah.
auditing these holloways, identifying where they were, understanding their histories, where are they connecting, who used these paths, what are the stories that we can tell, because Davies managed to get some amazing stories from the North York Moors, people bringing fish on ponies up from Whitby across the moors, and so on and so on. So the stories are there; they're in the archives, but you need to identify the paths, and then you need to start working hard on the looking at the archives to understand them even further.
Yeah, I mean they're tremendous sites. They're so evocative, as you say, and I think what's most jarring or dissonant is that very few people walk them now, maybe one or two a day, and yet they're meters deep, and that was caused through the erosion of hundreds and thousands of people over millennia walking them and generations. So yeah, I can't believe that we don't cherish these unique sites more.
We need to get out there and get walking them. As I say in the book, it's a bit like pinning a butterfly. It's a beautiful thing, but then it's no longer alive. You've killed it.
Yeah,
We need to keep these things alive, and to do that, we need to walk them.
excellent.
That's
Ginny, any other
Yeah,
questions?
I was going to say that's a really interesting point, and it sort of brings me to this next question from Patrick, who asked, "What drove people to find the courage to undertake these long journeys?" We were just talking about that, how
Mm.
people need to get back out there, but historically, yeah, what was the driving sort of cause for that?
There's loads of reasons why people move around in the past. I mean, there's plethora of merchants. I talk about lots of these long distance movements, merchants, but also people driven by religion. So you've got the big pilgrimages as another reason for moving in the past. And again, that is especially by sea. But the basic thing, I think, is a completely basic human belief or mindset of just pure wanderlust, of needing to know. That's why we as a species exist in almost every part of the planet. Is this desire, this need that kind of drives us on to understand what's over those mountains, what's crossed that sea. It might be death, but it might also be full of glories. And there's some wonderful writers out there. There's the anthropologist Mary Helms is someone that jumps to mind. She's written beautifully about uh, how prestigious this can be. In the past, people to travel to sort of distant lands and bring back exotic things, and then they're gifted, a polar bear to the Pope, for example. These things are really so, and it raises your own prestige as well by doing that. They're in a sense they're heroes' journeys. You can see it in the Neolithic. People traveling far to get distant things, or the polished axes from the Italian Alps, traveling far across Europe and even ending up in the Somerset levels and places in Britain. So the people are driven for various reasons. I mean, love probably is another reason that people move great distances, for loads and loads of reasons. And I try to cover as many of them in the book as possible. But just the basic human desire, that basic human wanderlust, I think is the main reason. And that's, I just think, is amazing.
And that kind of touches on something that you mentioned earlier and through the book. There's a kind of intrinsic value just to journeying, that journeying for journey's sake. Of course, health and well-being dimensions are very important now, particularly with the rough and tumble of modern life. I wonder if you could expand on that a little.
Yeah, I mean, so there's actually very good science now behind the connection between walking and mental health, which I wasn't completely aware of actually when I wrote Footmarks. But walking is part of my daily routine, and it keeps me sane. It keeps me from. But when I do have moments, as we all do, when I dip down, I will walk, and I'll walk a lot. I might walk the entire day. I might walk 20 miles sometimes. And
Sounds like you've got a very forgiving dog with you there.
yeah, I do, and family as well. But yeah, no, walking is so important to mental health. I think pretty much the most important thing that we can do. Actually, it's my form of therapy. Being inside Holloway's again is to me is something to do with the embrace of the deep sides either side of you, focusing on that light at the end of the tunnel, that pinpoint at the end. Really, it's a metaphor for life, and so I think, yeah, it's a fundamental importance.
So mobility helps us get closer to the past, but it also has this huge dividend as we move ourselves in the present. That's fascinating. Ginny, is there any other questions?
There are indeed. So we've had a question from Brendon. Now we've got one from Jim. Jim asks, "How do you?"
We should say we're not asking our own question.
Jim was wondering how sea level changes have impacted studies of coastal migrations.
Um, so I don't know exactly where this question is coming from, but to put my own spin on it. I mean, I wrote a book a long time ago, quite a few years ago now, 10 years ago now, called The Remembered Land, which is about the landscape that's now under the North Sea, called Doggerland, or in the book I call it North Sea Land, because it was called that before it was known as Doggerland. But anyway, and this was a wonderful, lush, low-lying wetland landscape that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived. It was their heartland, but of course, as ice sheets flooded and sea levels rose, it pushed the land got smaller and smaller, and it pushed these people inland. That's when I say a question like that, that's my immediate go-to. But I'm not sure exactly what Jim is getting at there.
So particularly with Skipsea, the
Yeah.
east of the country, has over millennia, has sea rise had any impact on the archaeology there?
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, Skipsea is the fastest eroding coastline of anywhere in the United Kingdom. It loses a foot, sometimes more, each year. And you can go there now, and you can just see these roads that just go off the cliff because it's been eaten into. If you go down, there's a wonderful ice cream parlor called Mr. Moo's, famous within the archaeological world because it's located in this amazing archaeological landscape. But just down from Mr. Moo's, there's a wonderful little beach you can go to, and if you go onto that beach and then turn around and look back at the cliff edge, you can see the one of the Mesolithic lakes in section, and that's just eroding out onto the beach all the time. It's being eroded out. And archaeology is being lost. So yeah, it's, again, I mean, it's very difficult to understand, the Mesolithic movements because it's being eroded by modern sea level change.
But at least you can console yourself with some good ice cream, though.
Well, yes, of course, yeah. And Mr. Moose is fantastic. When we're digging in Skipsea, and on a hot day, the team will come out with some ice creams for our team, which is wonderful.
That's really great. Anything else, Ginny, that you can see there?
Yes, so Nigel was asking, do you think that ancient track or routeways might follow even older animal migration routes?
Yeah, I do, and I think you can see. So routeways they're sort of formed by habit in a sense. Very few routeways are engineered in the way that we understand, motorways as these things that are sort of planned on paper. Although even motorways actually tend to follow older roads and routeways. But anyway, routeways are these things because they come up from they develop out of the people on the, people actually on the ground. They're formed out of habit, and they tend to follow things that were there before, whether they are animal tracks or earlier routeways. And you can see this in certain places. Sharpstones Hill is a good example of this. This is an engineered road which looks for all the world like it's a Roman road, and indeed does have a Roman road over it, but it's actually an Iron Age road with a metal surface and stuff. And then underneath that, there's actually evidence for an even earlier prehistoric routeway, possibly a Neolithic routeway, which itself would have derived from presumably animal routes, migration routes, and so on. So yeah, I think that all tracks and routes have this history about them, which we don't ever think about. Uh, and quite often it's very difficult to get to, simply for the fact that routes are worn down. They're not always built up. So to understand that archaeology requires a lot of work. But yeah, routeways have there's a I think I say in the book there's a whiff of history about all roads.
Yes. So that intertwining between the natural, what we think of as the natural landscape, and the historic landscape, even goes all the way back. There are early antecedents of it.
Yeah, this sort of this thing that we see. We're taught from school children. What did the Romans give us? They gave us a road system. Even that's being really sort of undermined by the presence of Iron Age roads and good engineered roads in some instances.
A controversial opinion: the Romans didn't do anything for us anymore.
What did the Romans ever do for us?
Central heating, maybe taxation. Interesting parties. That's what I was told. That's fantastic. Anything else, Ginny, in the chat?
Yep, I think we've got time for one last one. So Doug has asked if AI might help reveal movement in future around and between archaeological sites.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question, and a really good question. AI, of course, wasn't such a big thing when I was writing Footmarks, and it has become in the last few years. It's one of these things that really divides people. Just the mention of the letters AI sends some people into, hate-filled diatribes. But I think that it can do wonderful things. Actually, we already know that AI is good at picking out, early cancer cells in breast cancer and so on. Used in the right way, AI could transform our lives. And I hadn't thought about it revealing movement, but I can see that could be the case when we're dealing with big areas and lots of routeways. AI is likely to be able to help. Of course, we can use GIS. I mean, people use GIS a lot now, and using that to understand them. But I can see AI really helping. AI not so helpful when it comes to writing books written by AI and not by humans. But one of the reasons why I make sure that I made sure when I was writing Footmarks that there's a lot of me in it, is to make sure that it was clear that it was written by an actual real human with
Yes.
sensitivities.
I'm glad you covered that off. You almost taught yourself out of a job there, Jim. So we're going to bring this to a close now, but we really look forward to your next book on the Neolithic. You've gone into depth and detail on your process. We will be your accountability partners, and we look forward to that appearing soon. Ginny, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Jim, for joining us. And of course, to everyone in the chat as well for all your fantastic questions. So before we say goodbye, I'm just going to share 2 events that we have coming up. First, on Wednesday, the 12th of March, we're going to be hosting a live stream about one of our favourite projects in the Boyne Valley, where we're investigating 2 Neolithic monuments near the famous UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bruneboyne. Brendon will be returning again, and he'll be joined by Geraldine Stout, who is one of the world's foremost authorities on Bruneboyne, author and excavator of Newgrange, Knowth, and several other megalithic sites. So it's definitely worth a visit if you're into all things prehistory. And then on Tuesday, the 25th of March, we'll be hosting another DV Trends event. This one's going to be about alternative business models, and our panel are going to discuss innovative business and governance models that challenge tradition and purpose pioneering solutions that can help archaeology be more ambitious, sustainable, relevant, and fit for the future. So anyone who works in the archaeology or heritage sector, or anyone who's interested in alternative business models, that's definitely one for you to check out as well. Without further ado, we'll say a final goodbye to our panelists and a final thank you. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Footmarks if you enjoyed today. We'll be sharing a link in the email at the end where you can find that. So yes, thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
And we'll see you all again soon.
All the
Bye,
best.
everyone.
Bye.